from the CyberHub bunker and studio. You're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast, Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
Well, folks, welcome to another episode of Tech Corner here on the CyberHub podcast. I've got the legend joining me once again today. I can't get enough of Roger on the show. Roger Grimes, he's the data-driven defense evangelist over at KnowBe4. He's the author of 12, now 13 books, his most recent one on ransomware. Can I keep going? You're like on... You're working on critical infrastructure. You're working on all kinds of stuff, Roger. If you don't know,
And this week is funny. Am I doing MFA? Am I doing quantum? You know what I've been doing heads down all week, like literally relearning something I thought I knew well: password attacks and defenses.
So why? Because it seems like like we figured out the whole password dilemma.
Yeah, so it's part of it is it's a funny thing. Hey, we're going to passwords are going away. Well, we have the average person has like 3 to 19 passwords that they use on over 170 different websites. Every it's that old joke, the old canard. Every time I hear we're going to a paperless society, I want to buy stock in Hammer Mill. Well, every time I read an article that says passwords are going away, I want to buy a password managing vendor or something, if such a thing existed. But really what happened was I've been writing a lot about passwords, and I believe that I have some of the best understanding of password attacks and password defenses. And I routinely put out kind of this chart saying, hey, this is really what your password policy should be. And, it comes down to password attacks are kind of like mostly social engineering or stealing, right? Like probably half the attacks are I just social engineer you out of your password, or I steal it using malware, or I break into a website on the internet. So the vast majority of password hacking is really, they don't really care what your password is. They steal it, either social engineer, steal it from a site, steal it from you. Maybe they even just do, a password reset bypass. But it comes down to really the two big attacks where your password length and complexity means anything comes down to two things. One is password guessing, which is where you have somebody either manually trying to guess your password on some type of login portal or API, or automated password guessing. But those attacks can be devastating through password spray attacks and all kinds of other stuff, or password hash cracking. And really, my week has been heads down because I love the idea of the password hash crack. I actually think password hash cracking is not that big of a threat because if they've got your hashes, 99% of the time they own you, right? They've broken into your device, they're admin, they're root, the domain admin. So I really think worrying about password hash attacks are really kind of a 1%er attack, 2%er attack. Like penetration testers do it all the time because they want to prove your passwords are weak or whatever, but really it's not that big of a threat because they don't really need to crack your password. They can replay the hashes on Windows. They can keylog you, and they don't care how long or complex your password is. So I really don't get overly thrilled about password hash cracking, except for there are some ways I can steal your hash without being super admin. Like there's a way where I can send you an email and it has a malformed URL in it, and if I can trick you into clicking on it, then many times I can steal your password hash and then begin to crack it. Or let's say that I find your password hash on an attacker breaks into a website and they don't have your password, plain text password, they have your hash. So they have your password hash and they can't reuse that hash in other places. But if they can crack it back to the plain text password, then it gives them the ability to attack you. So there are some scenarios where password hash cracking has some concern and some viability. Again, I think it's a small percentage, but it's still something. But the part that's always amazed me is how fast we're cracking passwords. I've been a penetration tester for 20 years. And back in my day when I did a lot of password hash cracking, I was using John the Ripper, and I was cracking I was doing 1 million password hash guesses a second. A couple of years ago, I read that they were doing 350 billion password guesses per second. So what blew me away this week is twofold. One is I learned that we now have the capability, the average person, me and you, have the capability of doing over 100 trillion guesses per second. I mean, how many passwords are going to stay viable at 110 trillion guesses per second? Not a lot. And let me say, I talked to a password hash cracker that told me he's routinely breaking 18 character passphrases that have some complexity in them. And he recommends everybody use like a 30 character phrase. But so I actually met up and talked with Sam Crawley of Hashcat. He's on the Hashcat development team. And I learned, I was like, hey, man, I want to find out how this is done. It was amazing. There's a lot of people that have password hash cracking rigs that can do 2 trillion guesses per second. So me or you could literally do 2 trillion guesses per second. Then there are people that are running password hash cracking rigs. I'd say the elite that are doing like 40, 45 trillion guesses per second. But then the cryptocurrency, if you take a cryptocurrency, a Bitcoin miner, just a typical small Bitcoin miner shop, they're capable of doing 100 trillion guesses per second. And then again, the Hashcat developer told me for $50 to $100, anybody can rent enough processing power on Azure or Amazon to do over 100 trillion guesses a second for $50 to $100 per hour, which is not cheap, but
not cheap. But if you're cracking, let's say your conversion rate's 1% of 100 trillion.
Yeah, and here's the wild part too. Suppose you're using a truly complex password. So you're using a password manager or generator, and you're just like, beep, here's my password, some big ugly thing, right? 10 characters is enough to stop almost everybody. 12 characters is probably enough to stop a nation state, because it's just the sheer amount. Like the numbers are so large at a random, truly 94 characters on your keyboard. Random. If you choose a 12 character truly random password, you're stopping even the nation states, the most moneyed adversaries, unless there's some, super advanced technology we don't know about.
But you're studying quantum. So we're talking about non-quantum processing power here, right? So we're talking traditional computing.
Yeah, and I think at best, remember, quantum doesn't speed up everything. And I think even in the best case scenarios, password hash cracking or something, we're probably just talking a doubling. So you could add 1 character, let's say. So let's say 10 characters protects you today. By going to 12, you're even putting off quantum attacks. So
here's a really interesting aspect of it. We make a lot of passwords, right? You and I have had so many conversations around MFA. And that kind of brings up the whole, why are they still in the business of password hashing and cracking in a world where I think there's a lot of MFA still deployed?
Well, there's not enough MFA deployed. I think maybe 2% of the world's sites and services can even use MFA. But even behind the scenes, like on an Active Directory network, even if you're using MFA, or you're using smart cards or something, really behind the scenes, what's used is an NT hash. So they literally kind of generate this random like hash, and then they put it in it's attached to your user account, the NT hash. And If you're using Kerberos, it uses the NT hash. Well, so even many times if you're not using MFA, behind the scenes, the Kerberos or NTLM token is using a randomly generated hash, and we don't really have any idea of what that hash is. It really 256 characters of randomization entropy? Probably, but a lot of people don't know there's still a hash. Like what I mean by that is if somebody dumps your hash in a Microsoft Active Directory network, that NT hash will work as if you had MFA behind the scenes. You can still do pass the hash attacks and access everything you need to access. Because
is that on on-prem Active Directory or is that on Azure Active Directory?
Well, let me say it's definitely on-prem, but I assume that there's some carry. I haven't done Azure Active Directory attacks, but I think it's the same unless they've completely redone the way
they've kind of redone a little bit of Azure Active Directory. That's one of the things they pride themselves on, is that Azure Active Directory doesn't have some of the illogical steps that you would that a traditional on-prem AD does.
But sometimes, like when I was at Microsoft, that was a couple of years ago, you couldn't do longer than 16 character passwords in Azure, right? Like,
I mean, you
could do. So someone go quote, it depends on how Azure AD works today. So,
I mean, but Azure AD, so talking about password hashing always takes me down the road that I'm a bit torn myself on, right? Because I'm really torn about passwordless. And I'll tell you why I'm torn. And I think we can talk a little bit about passwordless to password hashing. And I think all of this kind of comes together, right? So passwords and credential stuffing is the number one way successful cyber events are initiated. Would that be fair? I mean, based on the work you guys do at KnowBe4, I think that so
social engineering is the number one way by far. Unpatched software, all the password stuff overall fits in right now in a bucket of about between 15 and 25% of attacks. Okay. It's higher in ransomware, but overall it's probably lower. But let's say it's a quarter of attacks maybe. But unpatched software is higher. Social engineering is far higher. But passwords
social engineering. When you talk about social engineering, there's two types of social engineering, right? There's the type of social engineering where I need you to click a link to download a payload, and that payload is smart enough and sophisticated enough to where your EDR and XDR and all the different, 3-letter acronyms that you would deploy on an endpoint to recognize something would recognize. But then there's the other part of social engineering. I think the more sophisticated part of social engineering, which is what we're seeing a lot on LinkedIn and in other places where I kind of walk you through a journey. So it's the more patient kind of stuff where you and I establish an email relationship. We build trust. I eventually send you a link which is completely innocent, and it takes you to a completely innocent website. So we've built that trust. I then take you to a link where you have to enter credentials, where now I've taken your credentials and now I'm able to escalate privileges, because with your credentials and with this specific vulnerability, I've kind of got the perfect sauce, right, to launch and initiate an attack. Passwordless, kind of, especially on the Microsoft side of it, right? They're really big on Windows Hello, right? They're like Windows Hello, device-based biometrics. I agree with that. As long as it's device-based biometrics, I feel a little bit better with it. Mm-hmm. Because I think anytime you put biometrics for to me is just a math formula. It's all it is. It's an algorithm. It's some sort of programming that takes your face and creates a formula of sorts that creates an ID token that says, this is Roger, give him access.
Yeah.
Do you see passwordless as kind of being the end all to this kind of stuff?
I think that, the end all be all is kind of zero trust, right? I mean, meaning that there can be different attributes that say, I think it's device based, right? Is Roger and James coming from a device they're normally coming from? And then there's some type of zero trust checks. Either like today, I was talking to a cool, interesting company called Beyond Identity, where they actually do all kinds of kind of zero health check things as part of the authentication. But I certainly think on the back end, you want the system you're authenticating to be doing these zero trust checks. So I think the future is going to be a combination of ways that you're authenticated, but the vast majority is this zero frictionless thing, which is Roger and James doing what they normally do? Are they, like if I go into my bank account, do I go check on my bank account balance? But if I go to all of a sudden to transfer all my money to a Russian bank account, then it kicks up and says this is an unusual thing. So I think the ultimate future is probably something closer to what your credit card is today, where you use it, everything's fine. Every once in a while, it bugs you for some type of higher authentication. It was funny. You always hear with the passwordless future. I almost want to laugh because the first time I read an article saying that passwords are going away, I think it was 1987. Out of my 1,200 articles, I think I've written 2 passwords are going away soon articles myself. I gave up writing them like 12 years ago because it's kind of embarrassing to be wrong for multiple decades. So every time I see one of these people going passwordless society, I literally want to buy stock in a a password manager company if one actually existed, because if I look at, we have more passwords. We have more passwords than we've ever had, supposedly. And let me say, I've got more MFA, but now I got like 5 or 6 different types of MFA. I got SMS based, I got token based, I've got a biometric and a fingerprint.
Yeah, but I think we're the exception, Roger, right? Because you and I are geeks, we're nerds. We go to stuff to break it, so we try it. I think the average user. So something.
I'm talking about what I'm forced to use.
Right, but I think the average user, right? So I look at some of my friends who work for a company. They've got a company issued device. They do either token based or SMS based multi-factor to get access to stuff. I kind of see that being a little different though, because I think that in the grand scheme of things, right? I don't ever think we're going to go away from passwords. And I'll tell you why. It's kind of like we're never going to go away from wearing clothes.
I'm with you, Jan. Actually, I'm with you. Keep going, because I agree with you.
Passwordless is going to be effective to a specific subset of online users. But it's really not going to be a be-all for everyone. There's a reckoning coming that I think most people are paying a blind eye to. They're not really paying attention to, and that reckoning is around biometrics. We see what's going on in China with biometrics and what's going on in other places around the world with biometrics. In the EU, it's literally illegal to keep biometrics unless you've got someone's full consent, and then they can't be on your servers. They can only be device based, and they've got to have some level of encryption on them and so forth. And I think we're coming towards a reckoning where biometrics, this whole idea of biometric passwords is going to backfire.
Well, obviously, biometrics are not as accurate as anybody says anyways, right? Like your fingerprint may be unique in the world, but the way that we capture them and utilize and reuse them, they're hideously inaccurate.
Well, it's 40%. I think on an iPhone, you've got to match 40% of the original print.
Well, it's a lot of times, and let me say, I don't know that set. That's a good one to hear, but there's these points, right? And they make your finger be like the constellation stars, right? Like, so they take the ridges and valleys and things, and they're like, okay, they map all these changes. And then in your phone, you have in any fingerprint scan, typically the way they're like, you have to have a 4-point match, 6-point match, 8-point match. And some of them will even capture, your veins or something like that as part of it to add to it. But the problem is that, well, ignoring for the point someone can capture it and then create, if someone gets your real fingerprints, like I'm sure your fingerprints, my fingerprints were stolen in the OPM attack of 2015, right. And then all 10 fingerprints are out there, owned by China now. But, you can't repudiate your fingerprint once somebody has it. And fingerprints work a lot. Like they work on our cell phone because most people aren't trying to break into our cell phone. The person who steals my cell phone is trying to smoke that phone's memory and reuse it and resell it to somebody. It works at work to get me in the office, a fingerprint scan or something, because I'm physically present and there's a real, if I'm a fake person, I'll be, there's a risk to me being caught. But if we start doing widespread biometrics for remote stuff, that's just going to really be abused by attackers who have our biometrics. If your fingerprint gets stolen, if your retina scan what are you going to do?
Yeah. Not only you can't change your fingerprint, you can't change your face, you can't change your retina. But I think that takes us into a more interesting conversation, which is around kind of the concept of zero trust and identity access, right? Which is, I think we need passwords and we need get rid of passwords, start with passphrases, right? Have zero trust. So authenticate and authorize, trust but verify every time.
Yeah, and let me say, the reason why I think passwords will be around forever, besides you just have so much like I laugh and people are like, we're gonna get people, the FCC saying we're gonna update the phone system, get rid of robocalls. You have equipment out there that's 50, 60 years old, in the phone system. But the same thing with passwords. You're talking about a billion websites that have to be updated, many of which haven't been updated forever, and mom and pop. And you have 2-year-olds that can do a password. You have 90-year-olds that can do a password, and those people on the other end, they're going to have a tougher time doing, MFA or biometrics. So I think the reason why passwords are going to be around forever is they're easy to use, they're cheap to implement. You need to change your password, you can change your password. There are actual reasons why passwords are still the number one authentication method for decades. My first MFA token, RSA Secure ID, I saw decades ago. It didn't take over the planet. Passwords are still here. And it's because they actually are cheap and they work, and they have, if you look at, most people, if you get your password stolen, maybe they steal your credit card and you get a new credit card or something like there are repercussions to someone stealing your password. But other day, someone told me, Roger, you need to have a 50-character passphrase to protect your password manager and to log into your laptop. 50 characters. And I said, I would rather lose all my passwords than have to type in a 50-character passphrase.
This is kind of the definition of madness, right? Is here's a password manager. By the way, you've got to defend your password manager so no one gets access to your password manager.
Yes, and protect it with MFA. But there's always trade-offs. And the biggest issues in your life are you or a loved one in the ER. Everything else is just kind of life. And we want passwords and we want MFA, but in very few cases is it life-threatening if someone gets your password or your MFA. You lose something and there's some problem in your life for a while, but typically they aren't stealing all your money forever. Typically they aren't physically hurting you. Typically you aren't losing your job. So it's like some people underappreciate that passwords are the right level of security, good and bad, for the problem that they're trying to protect. Just because my password gets compromised doesn't mean that my life stops, right? It's just a problem, and I take care of the problem.
Yeah, it's again, you're kind of talking about, as you're describing passwords and kind of the easy application that anyone could use a password, right? It kind of brought me to the idea of a stick shift versus automatic. So 30 years ago, every car was a stick. You had to pay extra for automatic. Today, you want to get a stick shift, you got to pay extra for a stick shift over an automatic because the automatic became the standard because it's so damn simple, right? And the same applies with passwords. I think there's a very interesting kind of thing that's going on with the whole password conversation. And I don't think there's a right or wrong approach to passwords. I think the only wrong approach with passwords is like an 8-character password. Wrong approach. But if you look at everything else, passwords are part of a greater security resilience. It's another it's a piece of a greater puzzle. It's a piece in the chessboard, and it's one piece. And if anyone's ever able to compromise you because of getting your password, then you've got greater problems than how long or how sophisticated or unsophisticated your password was. A password being compromised shouldn't be the be-all, end-all. And I think that's one thing that's always missed. What's your take on that?
No, I think you're right. The other day I had a reporter, a really smart reporter, interviewing me about MFA, and I was complaining about MFA, phishable MFA being a problem. And he said, well, if we get this figured out, will that solve the problem? And you, James, have asked me multiple times, well, is this going to fix the problem? Because I think you're asking the question because you know the answer. And it's like, nah, like if we move from passwords to MFA, it's not like hackers and malware are going away, right? They're just going to change the phishing link that works with passwords only to the phishing links that work with MFA and whatever your MFA is, right? But the real problem that we need to solve is, why is it so easy for people to steal stuff on the internet? And until we fix that problem, and let me say, I've been writing for decades on this. I have a white paper called Fix the Internet that talks about at least one solution of how to fix it. The reason why we have all this rampant crime and we're worried about passwords and phishable MFA is that it's so easy for people to pretend to be other people on the internet and get away with it and never get prosecuted. And until we solve that problem, everything else, passwords, passwordless, MFA, it's all a game of whack-a-mole, right? Before, 30 years ago, I was worried about boot viruses. And then I got worried about macro viruses. And then I got worried about email spamming bots. And now it's ransomware. And the problem is the same problem. Like there used to be a lot of people in the 1920s that robbed banks because they could go across state lines. They would usually rob banks close to a state line. The defenders didn't have really good communication. We didn't have all the Soviet, and they were getting away with it. But in the 1920s, after a bunch of bad guys were shooting up people with machine guns and stuff like Tommy guns, and they started to make it harder for them to get away with it. And they started to do interstate communication and tell the law enforcement you can go across state lines and county lines. And once they stopped making it so easy for people to rob banks, people stopped robbing banks. But I mean, not from the defensive thing, but just from the ability for people. Once you stop allowing people to get away with it all the time, it stops. And that's what the internet is this pervasive anonymity where you're almost more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to be prosecuted for an internet crime. And as long as that inequality exists, we're going to have internet crime. We need to fix the underlying problem, which is that people get away with internet crime.
So you're talking about deterrence, something I've been a big fan of and have been talking about for quite a bit over the last several years. How do you create deterrence? Well, the internet, so you brought up the bank robbing kind of, scheme of things. Why did people rob banks? Because it was easy. They could get away with it, right? You rob a bank on the border of Texas and Oklahoma, and you end up in Oklahoma. Well, Texas Rangers don't have any authority in Oklahoma. They don't have really jurisdiction. And unless the federal kind of FBI got involved, only then would you be liable to get caught and so forth. And it kind of brings the whole kind of discussion around deterrence. And what deterred people from robbing banks wasn't just the prosecution, but it was you got hunted. And a lot of the people who robbed banks died in shootouts. Some of the best Westerners. Like if you love old 1960s, 70s movies, right? Like old Clint Eastwood, James Dean, just go watch like old cinema, right? When movies were like unbelievable without all the CGI BS and all the stuff, when it was just acting, right? And you'd see the ketchup packet explode in someone because that was the blood, right? Like real cinema. You learn to appreciate the deterrence of what that made people think about before they committed a crime, right? And that was part of the reduction. The challenge we have in security and fixing the internet is as an American, if I'm being attacked by someone who's based out of Russia, I don't have an extradition treaty with Russia. And now it's a political play. And it's a political play that ends up kind of, now we're starting to see the Putin crackdown on ransomware gangs was for him to run a pipeline. I mean, that's literally, he's like, you want me to stop ransomware? Okay, give me pipeline. And they were like, give him a pipeline, stop ransomware, right, from Russia. And now we saw last week, there was a story of how a lot of Russians criminal actors are starting to work with their Chinese counterparts for a lot of these attacks because they know that if Russia starts clamping down on them, they'll just move to China and do everything out of China.
So you're right. Now you're right. So we need to fix it's a physical problem, it's a logical problem, it's a political problem, it's a legal jurisdiction problem. And we need, Russia is literally, Putin loves that ransomware happens. He's probably taking a cut of it, would be my guess, and getting filthy rich off of it. We need to, but if I can identify every attack as like today, we've started to identify the cryptocurrency exchanges that are allowing the ransomware people to cash out the currency. So this is actually one of the smart plays that CISO and Jen Easterly have been doing. And in the Biden administration, they actually been going to the exchanges that they can track where it's being cashed out and going, okay, We can't stop you from getting the money because it's because it's Bitcoin and all this stuff. But we can actually make it illegal for anybody to do currency exchange with you on a legal perspective. And the guy's like, no, I'm legal. They're like, nope, we just put you on our do not block list. And it so destroys the guy's business. So if you're going to take your cut of this ransomware money and you're only getting a cut of whatever they're transferring, well, we're going to destroy your legal business. So so they're trying to hit them financially. They're trying to put political pressure, but it all comes down to, like, all the Russians would have to do maybe is start going through American-based Azar servers. Now we don't know they're doing it from Russia. If we have to rebuild the internet's infrastructure to make it harder for people to pretend to be other people, and until that happens, we're not going to stop internet crime. You're right; they'll move from Russia to China to Bulgaria to
Romania to Estonia to Latvia to Moldova to Belarus.
Whack-a-mole. It's whack-a-mole.
Well, but they do that already, right? I mean, I personally think that we ought to start looking at how do we create deterrence at a personal level, right? Because I think one of the problems is if you're a small-time ransomware operator, and there's a bunch of small-time ransomware operators that you and I've never heard of, but these guys are making probably $50 to $60 million a month out of ransomware. Just no one knows they're doing it because they're doing it at $25,000 a pop, right? They're doing it at $30,000 a pop, $10,000 a pop, $50,000 a pop, $100,000 a pop. They're not going for 5, 10, 25 million. They're going after small companies. They're negotiating. They're taking the 5 digit payment, and they're moving on.
They're background noise.
Right. But they know that the FBI doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with them. They know law enforcement doesn't have the bandwidth to deal with them. They know the companies they're going after aren't really going to hire a big, cybersecurity company to identify him and write a report and put out a press release. And I think, we're so focused always on, the big noise that it kind of goes into warfare, right? If the art of war, right? It really does go into the art of war, where we're so focused by the guy who's making the biggest noise, like the Imitat, the Imitat gang, or the folks who went over Colonial, and I'm forgetting a bunch of their names because I try to keep bad names out of my head.
They just change names, right? Dark Energy, Black Matter, or whatever.
Right. Black Matter, Dark Knight, you name it.
Or evil, Satan.
No, they all do that. But I think, Roger, we look at this and we need to kind of start sticking it. I think the greatest deterrent to all of this is allowing companies to have some level of deterrence. And I don't know that should be a private, like, hey, company X, and I've got these 20 really cool hackers that are going to hack you back if you hack me. I don't think that's going to work. Attribution is very difficult in our industry.
Yeah, offensive security, yeah.
And misdirection is very common, right? Misdirection is extremely common.
Attribution is tough, yep. That's why you really have to fix the whole internet. You can't,
go ahead.
Anything besides fixing the underlying pipes that allows it all to happen. And I'm not saying you have to identify everybody, every transaction, but I should have the ability as a company to say, like, suppose I'm a bank. I should have the ability to go, I will not accept any packets unless they've been verified as to real identity. Boom, done. And it can be done. This is not a technological problem. We've had the ability technically to do this for decades. It's not a technical issue. It's hard to get people in your own family to agree on something. It's much harder for the internet, but it's almost like we need a tipping point event that forces people to go, okay, we need to do this. And then we'll do it.
That's my concern. I'll tell you what this is. This seems to me like almost a Patriot Act kind of reform against privacy. And this is where I think my American civil rights, kind of like my right to privacy, I don't want Big Brother knowing everything I do, to security. And I think this is our generation's largest and most challenging public debate.
I have the solution.
Our most challenging debate in today's era is safety versus privacy. How much privacy are you willing to give up to feel safe? And does that submission of privacy really give you the safety, or is it all fake?
You ready? You ready for this?
Shoot.
My solution, the fixed internet. Anybody can email me, rogerg@knowbe4.com. I'll send you my paper, Fix the Internet. I have created a framework where you and I and anybody else can have total anonymity. And we can go all the way up to guaranteed identity. And you and I, on a per connection basis, both sides agree what they will take. So if I'm connecting to my cryptocurrency site, the cryptocurrency is like, yep, we'll take anonymity. You know, if I connect to some type of addiction support counseling thing, we'll take anonymity. But then there's different levels to where somebody at a bank or me, my email server decides, nope, I don't want any traffic that's not completely verified. Or you could have banks. You have some banks that are shadow banks and some banks that are full identity. But I myself would say I would love it if nobody can connect to my email server unless they're fully identified. But if you and I want to chat on an addiction, and I'm not on an addiction thing, but if I was on an addiction website, okay, maybe you can be anonymous there. So that's where I think a lot of us would like to have that ability to have different levels of identity and assurance.
I think Apple kind of stole a little bit of your paper, right?
Okay.
Because Apple in the iCloud, in the new App Store model, and the privacy of 14.5 and 15.0, and JJ and I did a whole thing on this on Clubhouse multiple times. We've done this, I think, like probably close to half a dozen times. So today, when I download an app with Apple, if I choose to sign in with Apple, so I use my iCloud email, I can decide to show that email, or I can decide to hide it. If I decide to hide it, then the app developer does not see my iCloud email. They see a hashed kind of email that's a bunch of numbers and letters at iCloud.com. And then when that specific route, that hashed email, when they reply to me, is rerouted to my iCloud and vice versa. So there's never really any direct correlation.
It's known as pseudo-anonymity.
Right. So they can't really come at me and market and gather my data and build an attribute because they don't know who I am. I've got this kind of pseudo-anonymity.
Now we need that across every communication stream, every app, every OS.
But it's starting in Apple. I doubt Google will ever do anything like this. I think that defeats Google's business model. Google's business model is to gather so much data on you in order to keep their advertisers happy. So I don't see Google doing it. It was funny. I was at Costco and I saw that Facebook now has a Facebook kind of TV box where you connect it to your Facebook account and you can watch anything on Facebook, but you can also watch Netflix and Amazon. And I'm like, wow, Facebook's really going into this whole thing of just, we're going to gather more and more and more and more data on you. And this was like at the entrance of the end cap at Costco. So I was like, man, and I stood there for a little bit, seeing if anyone bought it. Now, no one touched it in the 15 minutes I stood there and kind of watched it. But I'm sure people are buying it, installing it, not understanding just how much of their privacy they're giving away in that very moment.
Yep. And I know we're running long, but I want to go someone on top. So remember, we were just talking about the 1920s and gangster shootouts.
Yeah.
I bought a Tommy gun.
No.
A real Tommy gun from the Tommy machine gun, company that made them back in the 20s. I don't know if you ever held one, James. It weighs like 35 pounds. And the magazine, or what do they call it? Am I using the right term?
Yeah, the magazine.
There is not a more difficult gun to change a magazine on God's green earth. I have my friends all the time, gun friends, and I'll hand it to them. Nobody can exchange it. Nobody can re-rack the thing. It has the hardest rack I've ever. So what I've noticed, you ever look in any gangster movie, they never put another set of bullets in. They shoot all their bullets, and then you'll never see somebody
reload. Even the Hollywood stuff's like, well, we don't know how to do this shit.
So watch it. They'll hold it. They'll shoot like 5,000 bullets out of it, like it never runs out of bullets. They never will update. You'll see people doing clips and stuff all the time, not on the Tommy gun. And there's a reason why that gun went away.
It wasn't user-friendly. Roger, yeah, we did go a little bit over, but it's always fun to talk to you. There's never enough time in the day to do something like this with you. I appreciate you coming on. Folks, Roger Grimes is the author of several amazing books. Data-driven Data-Driven Computer Defense. A great book, kind of a solid book, is something I read at least once a year, if not twice.
Thank you, my friend.
And it's on the back of my shelf right behind me. Also, Hacking Multi-Factor Authentication. If you're a security professional, you're deploying multi-factor authentication, his book, Hacking MFA, is probably one of the best books to have as a guideline to how you deploy and manage your multi-factor authentication in your organization. Really some great tidbits. And your new book it's out already, right? The book on ransomware.
Yeah, Ransomware Protection Playbook.
Yep. Ransomware Protection Playbook. That's the new book by Roger. I have yet to order that. I need to go get it on Amazon. So go and check it out, folks. Roger, you gave your email before, rogerg@knowbe4.com. How else can people follow you?
That LinkedIn. Go to LinkedIn. Look me up there. I write probably 1 to 2 to 3 articles a week. I'm broken. I wake up and I just have to write when I have a new epiphany or something like that. And I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but I'm probably writing more than the smartest guy in the room. So overall, it works out.
Folks, that's it for this Tech Corner. We'll be back with a lot more. Until then, make sure to check out our CISO Talk podcast. Make sure to check out our practitioner brief that's daily at 9 a.m. And until then, Roger, thanks so much for being on the show. Thank you all for watching.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.